We just learned about list elements, which were our first look at compound HTML elements, meaning that they necessitated elements be nested within other elements. And that was evident by the fact that we needed to nest list item elements within either an unordered list or an ordered list element. And moving on with that pattern, we're going to take a look at a type of element that's a little bit more compound even than list elements, but also extremely useful. And this is the table element. Table elements consist of three optional parts. First, we have the table head, which is denoted by opening and closing T head tags. Then we have the table body, which is denoted by opening and closing T body tags. And finally, we have the table footer, which is denoted by opening and closing T foot tags. Let's add some content into our T head tags, and we'll do this by first adding a TR opening and closing tag, which stands for table row. And within that is our table data, or essentially our columns of data. And it's very similar to what we did with lists, where we have these arbitrary number of columns that are nested in a part of this table row. And so if we go ahead and save our index.html page and refresh our browser, we can see what this looks like. And we see that we have three header columns within our table. Now let's add some content to the body of our table. And we do this in a very similar fashion to how we added content to our header, but with a slight variation. We still have the same table rows nested within our table body, but we changed to using table data cells rather than table header cells. And this is just HTML convention, but one thing that's worth noting is that we want to try and keep, or we definitely want to keep, the number of columns of each of our table body rows matching the number of columns in our table header rows. So let's go ahead and refresh this again, and we'll see that our table body data was added to our table columns. And it did a little bit of self-styling, but we can also see the need to learn some CSS in order to style this a little bit more nicely. Finally, let's take a look at our table footer elements, and they are essentially the same as our table body elements in every regard, both that they use a table row element nested within the footer and then table data cells nested within the table row. And again, we'll save this file and refresh it in our browser and note the effect that this has on our table. And it doesn't look like it does anything, but down the road, as we learn some more CSS and styling conventions, we'll see how the table footer becomes important. Now there's one last thing that we want to talk about with regard to tables, and that is the call span attribute. Now we're going to talk about attributes in the next section, but we'll get a little bit of a feel for their power in this example. So let's suppose, for instance, that our table head only had maybe one or two columns in it, but our table body, we still wanted to have three columns. However, we didn't want the styling to get really thrown off as a result of a mismatch between the number of columns in our table head and the number of columns in our table body. So we can add what's called a call span attribute and specify how many columns we want any given column of content to span. So we could do something like call span 2 in this table head cell and remove one of these. And if we go ahead and if we save and refresh our web page, we'll notice that column 1 header is now spanning two columns. And we can do this with table head, table body, and table foot columns.